11 to 32. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he went off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. And for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate."
You'll get the second half later. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. For the last 2,000 years, Jesus' parables and teachings have excited the imaginations of theologians, biblical scholars, and preachers, and of course lay people, but a whole group of people whose creativity has been really stoked over the centuries, also has been artists, poets, people who are in the visual arts, in dance, in drama, all have found rich material to mine from Jesus' own teachings and parables and stories. Just to give you an example, just in recent years, the theme of the prodigal son has appeared in quite a number of movies, including some of these, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Big Fish, Color Purple, and also in the most recent Academy Award-winning film, Lady Bird, all drawing on the theme of the prodigal son. Well, few people realize that Shakespeare himself was deeply influenced by Jesus' teachings and parables, and regularly makes references to them in his plays. And of all of the teachings and parables that influenced Shakespeare, it appears that the prodigal son was first among them, at least given the amount of references in his plays. The prodigal son story is the most frequently biblical-based reference in any of Shakespeare's plays. So, for instance, King Lear, Henry IV, As You Like It, The Merchant of Venice, these are just a few of the plays where the theme of the prodigal son has been uplifted. What I like about and really love about the arts and the way it tends to delve into the story is that it tends to kind of get you thinking that other side of the brain that sometimes for some of us is a little bit dormant, and opens up insights that can be really profound. Like, I never saw it that way. It can really take us into incredible vistas of awareness that we never realized. Shakespeare is definitely among those who can do that. So this morning we're going to focus on just 4 very small Shakespeare references to the prodigal son. See if it opens up any vistas of awareness for you. We're very fortunate that as an open and affirming church, we have a thespian in our midst, and we are welcoming of all people, including actresses. So Marguerite Bennett is going to offer our first passage from The Merchant of Venice.
That ever holds. Who riseth from a feast with that keen appetite that he sits down? Where is the horse that doth untread again his tedious measures with the unbaited fire that he did pace them first? All things that are with more spirit chased than enjoyed. How like a younger or a prodigal the scarfed bark puts from her native bay, hugged and embrayed by the strumpet wind. How like the prodigal doth she return, with over-weathered ribs and ragged sails, lean, rent, and beggared by the strumpet wind.
Doesn't that just revolutionize your understanding of the prodigal son? In case you need a little modern translation, let me just offer this. What she's saying, or Shakespeare's saying, is essentially that's always true. Who gets up from a meal with the same appetite he had when he sat down? Can any horse retrace his footsteps with the same energy he had when he walked them the first time? We chase everything in life more excitedly than we actually enjoy when we get it. It's like when a ship sails out of the harbor with all its flags waving, gently pushed by the wind. When that ship returns, her timber is all weather-beaten, and her sails are ragged. That same wind makes the ship thin and poor. What I find interesting about that awareness that Shakespeare brings is kind of feeling the inner mind and heart of the prodigal, how it's terribly exciting, some of these things that lure us away from home until we finally kind of get what we are seeking and we realize, it's not so great. When I see this painting of the prodigal, and sit with it for a while, in many ways, this sad figure out with the pigs reminds me of a basic experience within American society we have. I see a lot of our kind of cultural malaise right now in that prodigal son. For instance, I see a great deal of excitement chasing after the American dream, getting ahead, moving up in life, but then this realization that, unless everybody's part of that ability to chase the American dream, it really becomes this have and have not society, and how great is that? Or I think about how wonderful it is to have political fervor and stand up for a cause and get excited and do something until our political fervor separates us so far from our heart center that we can't see the humanity in someone who may be politically different from us. Or I think of all the excitement of using the social media, which I use myself every day, and yet how also over time we start, the social media does its thing, and we start to hear from only those who agree with what we have to say, and get news stories that are only related to what we will already agree with, and we find ourselves in this little bubble, or a little silo. How lonely that can be. And I think about church, too. At some point, somebody woke up and realized, you know what, I'm probably not going to go to hell if I don't go to church every Sunday. And a lot of people will say, hey, I get more out of, I feel God when I go out into the hills or when I watch a sunset. Sunday morning, I want to experience God there. And of course, what idiot can't experience God in a sunset or in the mountains and so forth? But so it's a beautiful and wonderful thing. But what do we miss then when we actually get what we're looking for? While Melanie and I were on vacation last week, we had a call from our daughter Marin and her boyfriend Will. And Will had been in town and Marin was in town, and they decided to go to church. Will is Catholic, and so they said, let's try a Catholic church this morning. And so they just kind of looked one up and went. And Melanie and I are on the phone in the car. They're telling us about their experience of church last Sunday morning at the Omaha small Catholic church. And they starts out saying, well, it was the church had seen better days. The furnishings were kind of funky. It kind of felt like a little, like a old high school auditorium kind of feel, aesthetic, and the minister was about 175 years old. The priest, the congregation was a little bit younger, maybe 150. And they did the passing of the peace, and there was only 30 people. There were only 30 people there, and they did the passing of peace. It went on for 10 minutes. 10 minutes, you know. And then they for the songs and the liturgy, they used an overhead projector. That's how dated their technology was. An overhead projector, many of the pieces handwritten on this overhead. And we're just kind of waiting for the conclusion, you know, and that really sucked. Except the conclusion was, Will said, and it was one of the most beautiful services I've ever attended. I said, really? Why is that? He said, yeah, they didn't have all the modern technology, they didn't have the nice spiffy church, they didn't have a whole lot of people presence, but the sense of community was so profound there. It was evident that despite the fact that a whole lot of people wouldn't be caught dead in that church, they would be caught alive in that church. And they'd be alive together. And nobody was asking what political persuasion you were or how much money you had or anything. They were there, and they were together, and they were gathered around something real, and it spoke to me. I realized, yeah, we can, again, any idiot can find God in a mountaintop or a sunset. I find God those places myself. But what I don't find there is a sense of radically inclusive community. And when it comes down to it, I find God in community easily as much as I do in a sunset. Concludes one person who writes about worship, what if worship was more like a hilariously awkward family gathering than a performance? I love that. Maybe in future years, as our society goes, maybe we'll find a way of reconnecting to that sense of community that can't be found simply in the mountains. Well, King Lear, I want to turn to King Lear now and hear Shakespeare again, and maybe hear the parable again in a new way.
Had you not been their father, these white flakes did challenge pity of them. Was this a face to be opposed against the warring winds? To stand against the deep dread bolted thunder in the most terrible and nimble stroke of quick cross lightning? To watch poor Perdue with this thin helm? Mine enemy's meanest dog, though he had bit me, should have stood that night against my fire. And wouldst thou fain, poor father, to hovel thee with swine and rogues, forlorn and short and musty straw? Alack, oh, alack! 'Tis wonder that thy life and wits at once had not concluded all.
Okay, so again, if you need a little help, here's another take of the same wording. If you hadn't been their father, your white hair would have inspired in them only compassion. Is this a face that should have endured the freezing winds or withstood the dreadful thunder or the terrible lightning? To stay awake all night like a guardsman, poor lost soul, with only your thinning hair as a helmet? I would have let even my enemy's nastiest dog inside by the fireplace on that night, even if he had bit me. What this reminds me of is that the parable of the prodigal son isn't simply a parable of the prodigal son, it's really also a parable of the waiting father. It reminds me that it's not just the prodigal that was going through a lot of inner turmoil, but that father. And the father, especially, just the courage it was, not to just go in helicoptering into the far country and snatching him up from the pigsties and bringing him home, but rather to wait until his own child woke up. And just imagining, well, what if he doesn't? What if he doesn't? But this deep insight, he needed to find this, whatever he needed, on his own. This photograph was taken just over a week ago with my brother Scott in Bend, Oregon, where we were snowshoeing. And Scott and I are best friends, and it was so great to see him. But there was a time about 25 years ago when I didn't think I'd ever see Scott again. I was in seminary, and Scott had spent the last 10 years trying to be a rock star in Seattle. and never got signed with with a label, and was deeply discouraged by all the hard work he put in and really felt he had nothing to show for it. Heck of a lot of talent to show for it, but he felt it was like nothing. And so suddenly I get a phone call from my parents saying, we all knew Scott was deeply depressed, and they said he has disappeared. And for 3 days, actually, he'd been gone. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, well, we got to do something. My parents are saying, well, we're waiting, we're by the phone and stuff. And I just didn't think that was enough. I mean, I thought he might be in a hotel or someplace ready to do himself in. I mean, maybe we should just get the phone book and call every single hotel and motel in Washington State. Just to, wouldn't it be worth it to spend 24 hours making all these calls? But if we find him, we might be able to get him. And my parents were just like, no, we just need to wait. And so I finally called my minister. Said, hey, my parents aren't doing enough for my brother. And he said, wait, deep breaths. Wait a minute. Bottom line, if Scott is out to do himself in, it's his life and his choice, not yours. And second of all, if you go rushing in, let's say you're actually successful, you go rushing in and snatch him away while he's trying to do this work, what do you think the chances are that he'll found anything that sticks? You've got to wait and let him find what he needs to find, or not. It's his life. Oh my gosh, that was hard. And it turns out Scott, thank God he's alive, but he had actually gone out to eastern Washington, stood at the edge of a 100-foot cliff, and was preparing himself to jump. And was preparing, just letting go of everything, ready to jump. And Scott will tell you that when he was in the process of letting go, he found there were a few things that he just couldn't let go of. His love of his family and friends, his love of music, even though it had not taken him anywhere like he thought. And he still had this passion for life. So he stepped back from that cliff. And Scott will tell you that there's hardly been a day that has gone by that has not reminded him of his powerful connection to life, that even when he was ready to let go of it all, he refound again. Not everyone is that fortunate. But the principal being of this parable, I think, is that for those of us who remain behind when others are struggling, the drama is also with us. It's also with us. And sometimes love calls us to do nothing, even as love sometimes calls us to do something.
And we continue with our scripture reading. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back and sound." Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, "Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him." Then the father said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found."
Oh, where are we? We've already seen these. There we go. Oh, there we go. Back to Red. Do you guys see it? Red Gerard? The skier one. The snowboarder one, I should say. Sorry, that's showing my age, skiing. Red Gerard, Olympic gold medalist this year, skiing the men's snow slope. Did anybody see that competition? Oh my gosh, it was amazing. These snowboarders now are doing things with the human body that completely defy physiology, gravity, possibility. I saw Red Gerard go down that slope doing things that, I was just aghast at what he did. And he, of course, appropriately won the gold medal. However, I would have been more aghast had I not seen a virtually equally amazing, mind-blowing performance by this guy who's not standing on the podium. Anybody know who tried skiing and didn't get the gold or medal? See, we kind of forget their names. We remember Red Gerard. This is Kyle Mack. Kyle Mack had just earlier in the day done just what Red Gerard did, just blew my mind to pieces with what he was able to do, except at the very last jump. Coming down, he caught an edge and wiped out and didn't qualify. I thought to myself, now happily for Kyle Mack, he had another competition he qualified for, and he won a silver medal in another competition. But imagine if that had been his only competition. How he would have been, what his story would have been coming home from the Olympics. I failed. And yet, he was able to do things that just completely blow the minds of 99.9% of us. And yet, his dominant feeling would be, I failed? This parable of the prodigal son and the way that Shakespeare opens our minds to it a little bit more. He says, oh, I'm sorry, I missed it. Let's hear the parable. Let's hear Shakespeare, rather.
Know you before whom, sir? I, better than him I am before knows me. I know you are my eldest brother, and in the gentle condition of blood, you should so know me. The courtesy of nations allows you my better in that you are the firstborn. But the same tradition takes not away my blood, were there 20 brothers betwixt us. I have as much of my father in me as you, albeit I confess, your coming before me is nearer to his reverence.
Thanks, Marguerite. So, translation again, do you know whom you're talking to? And Orlando says, yes, better than you know me. I know you're my eldest brother and deserve more respect, but we're in the same family. So you should acknowledge that I am gentleman too. According to custom, as the firstborn, you are my superior, but it's not customary to treat me like I'm not even a gentleman. Even if there were 20 brothers between you and me, I have as much of our Father in me as you do. Though I admit you're closer to him and matter more because you're older. That's problem being part of a human family. But Shakespeare's noting, though, I think the amazing piece of the gospel in that no matter who we are as children of the same parent, there's nothing we can do to get rid of that identity. And in fact, and just like that ski competition, you may catch an edge and consider yourself a failure, but there's just as much of our God and the one who loves us most, whose love matters most in any of us as there is in the one who stands on that high podium with all the success in life. To me, I'm reminded of the fact that, I'm going to skip ahead here to this quote from Ephesians, that God destined us for adoption as God's children through Jesus Christ, according to the good pleasure of God's will, to the praise of God's glorious grace that God freely bestowed on us in the Beloved. When it comes to our relationship with our Creator, there's nothing we can do that separates us. There's nothing that we can do that makes us less of God's child than we were before. And it's not because we are so great, but it's because God is so great. Finally, let's turn to our last Shakespeare passage from The Merchant of Venice.
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crowned. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God's, when mercy seasons justice.
So again, little translation, something like this. No one shows mercy because he has to. It just happens, the way a gentle rain drops on the ground. Mercy is a double blessing. It blesses the one who gives it and the one who receives it. It's strongest in the strongest people. It looks better in a king than his own crown looks on him. The king's scepter represents his earthly power, the symbol of majesty, the focus of royal authority. But mercy is higher than the scepter. It's enthroned in the hearts of kings, a quality of God himself. Kingly power seems most like God's power when the king mixes mercy with justice. So although justice is your plea, consider this. I love that image that we concentrate on the blessing of the prodigal son, but there's also the blessing that comes to the father as well in giving that blessing. In this regard, I love this painting, this depiction of the father coming out and kissing the prodigal when the prodigal comes home from the far country, a painting painted by the Russian painter Oleg Korolev. The father looks like God. And of course, there's a reason for that. It's because when, the only grace that we're able to give to others is grace that's come to us from God. And when we give grace to others, then, of course, how is God's grace given to any of us? Normally through others. We experience God's grace through the grace that's given to us oftentimes through others. And so when we give grace to another person, it becomes for them an experience not just simply of us, but of God and God's grace. So the Father benefits through being godlike with respect to his Son in that moment. And his son, I love the depiction of the son. If you could see it better, you'd see that behind that light that's starting to come into him through the grace, there's this kind of, the flesh has been torn away. He's barely alive, behind him. It's just full of blackness and dark. And yet the grace that brings him back to to life. In theological terms, they call that prevenient grace. That is, grace that comes to us when our souls are dark and we can't see beyond the darkness. Grace comes in before we've even lifted a finger to create anything worthy of that light. And it acts like light that expands our pool of available reality. We realize, oh, I don't have to react to life in this way. I don't have to act in this way. I don't have to cower in this way. There's more now that I see because of this grace. When I think about that double blessing, I actually see many more than two blessings that comes when grace is received. Because the story of the prodigal son is really the story of you and me and God. And that's a story that's very much, I think, was in the background and is in the background of this meal and the prevenient grace that comes to us when we are walking in our own darkness. When we walked in darkness, when the world walked in darkness, a great light came and said, hey, pay attention. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this as often as you eat of it in remembrance of me. This is my blood, which is shed for you. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me. By eating this bread and drinking this cup, we remember Christ's death, we celebrate Christ's resurrection, and we also touch something that actually produces far more than a double blessing. We realize that we are blessed through the amazing grace that has come to us, but also that God is blessed in accepting the grace that is offered to us. God regains a son or daughter who has said yes to this relationship. And when we receive this and receive the grace it represents, God gets us back. And when we get God back and God gets us back, well, it's hard not to share the grace we've received with somebody else, adding blessing to blessing to blessing. You do not have to be a member of Countryside Community Church to participate in this meal. All we ask is if your heart calls you forward, come knowing you are most welcome here. So likewise, if you would care to receive communion from your seat, simply raise your hand as an usher passes and you'll be served there. Or if you'd prefer to remain seated altogether and simply participate in your heart, that works for us as well. But if you do come forward, we invite you to take a piece of bread, dip it into the cup. And perhaps this morning, and perhaps thanks to Shakespeare, we can all remember that when we receive the grace that comes through God, we receive a blessing, but we also bless God. We also bless God. I invite our servers to come forward to help us bless God and to be blessed. And as they do so, I invite you to join me in reminding ourselves of who we are and whose we are. We are an inclusive, open, and affirming family of faith, welcoming all to God's table of love and acceptance. We are diverse, yet united by Christ's example. We pray for one another, support one another, and challenge one another to become all that God creates us to be. We work together to nurture our community and to promote peace and justice in our conflicted world.